Proportional Response. Book 1. Chapter 21, Part 10. Down to Business. Fnth cocked her head a little and deliberately put a very bland look on her face as she watched Idiot Hash 2, whom she assumed had to be Idiot Hash 1's right-hand man, gag on the sidearm of the soldier who had been sent along as her escort. Damn soldier, he spoiled my chance to splatter that wannabe voter's brains across the wall. Idiot Hash 2 stood there wide-eyed with the soldier's gun in his jaws. The gun which had stopped him right in the middle of his rant. Fnth felt a little bit of respect, almost in spite of herself, at the soldier's speed and fluid movements. She took the rest of her audience in at a glance. No one moved and a sudden thick tension permeated the air. She let it build for a few beats, waiting for Soldier Boy to make his next move. But the man just stood there and stared at her. Guess he said all he's going to. Okay, so that is 2 idiots who are going to be coming with us on suspicion of betraying the rebellion. I'd honestly rather just shoot them here and be done with them. But it may be they are, in fact, spies. If that is the case, I am sure someone will be able to interrogate them and find out. She surveyed the room and saw a lot of frightened looks, some hopeful ones, and a few more angry glares. She looked at one of the hopefuls. You, what do you do for a living? The man spoke up with a quaver in his voice she didn't like. I'm an accountant, ma'am. She nodded. That will do. You are the leader of this cell until HQ sends word that you lot should choose someone else. I am going to give you a few contact details you can use to send reports, since this cell is one of those with off-world contact. Idiot Hash 2's eyes got even bigger, and she saw a lot of confused faces along with comments to the tune of, one of. An involuntary hiss escaped her lips and she had to fight to keep from screaming her words. Really? You mean this idiot told you that this cell was one of those with off-world contact information, and then he went further and told you that this is the only one, and you believed him? She shook her head. I haven't been briefed on all of the security measures, hells, not even on most of them, but even I know better than that. She shifted her gaze back and forth between the 2 idiots. It isn't looking good for either of you. She turned to the Solider. I think our moron here has gotten the point, don't you? The soldier suddenly stood 5 feet away from Idiot Hash 2, who still stood there with his mouth gaping, head at an odd angle, and visibly shaking. She turned back to the new leader. Your job for now is simple. Pass on any information that you think might be useful to the resistance. That is it. I am going to go ahead and train you lot in tactics and weapons, but you are not to put that training to use, or even meet again, until you get word from HQ. Now, Mr. New and Temporary Leader, I have a very important question for you. Who were the inner circle around dipshit and dumbass? The accountant looked up and began to point. He didn't even have his hand raised before Fnth heard the distinctive sound of weapons leaving their holsters. Moron. She allowed herself a small smirk of pride, directed at the soldier as 3 bodies hit the floor just before he'd managed to bring his weapon to bear. Not entirely fair of me, maybe. He didn't know it was coming. But a girl has her pride. One of the men moaned, and she felt a little of that pride slip. The last guy had been possessed of enough sense to try and start moving as he drew his weapon, and she'd had to go center of mass instead of headshot. The rest of the resistance cell looked at her with wide eyes, some of them glancing occasionally, as if for reassurance, at the soldier. Guess they have finally figured out who he is here to protect from whom. She allowed her own amusement at the thought to play into her voice. Anyone else? 3 days of intensive work later, and their ride showed up, along with some extra hands to take the 2 surviving troublemakers in tow. She suspected the pill they'd been made to swallow wasn't really a poison that only HQ had the antidote for, but she wasn't going to tell them that. She looked back over the unassuming shop door, which led to the underground tunnels they'd been using over the weekend, as she got into the back seat of the ground car, and suppressed a snarl. Hopeless bunch of moron! It is a minor miracle that none of them shot their own dicks off. And the Major wants me to do this again? As the car pulled away, she sat back and closed her eyes. I'm done with this crap. I'm going to go kill voters with or without the Major's help.
Admiral on the bridge.
Hands, mostly human ones, slapped down on console's railings, whatever happened to be handy, as they would on a Themercan ship. Good, raised Admiral Wimberson thought. They are past this silliness of abandoning their duties just because I walked in the room. The few people on the flag bridge who didn't have their faces buried in screens did of course come to attention and salute with that strange hand-to-eyebrow gesture humans used. He thumped his chest in response and allowed a small grin on one side of his beak. I may have joined their military, but I'm not retraining myself on how to salute. I didn't spend a lifetime in the Themercan military to go changing old habits just because High Command gave me secret orders. The people who'd stood to salute returned to whatever they'd been doing, and he felt the engines of the blast door behind him whir as those doors closed. A look at the large holographic plot in the pit of the flag bridge showed his fleet had assembled in proper formation. He walked around the bridge, took his seat, examined the formation for a few moments for effect, and pulled up the feed from their first target, the occupied Halcyon system which his fleet currently hurtled towards. The humans in that system have been doing well. They've kept the Galtons from making any real progress in gaining ground on the planet, despite the fact that they've had orbit all to themselves all this time. Still, the damned lizards are getting irritated enough with their losses on the ground to start bombing civilians. He chuckled to himself as the plot finally got a fix on all of the rocks headed towards the planet in contention, and the Zoltan ships following the trail back to an asteroid belt. He finally hit the buttons to call up all of his fleet's captains.
Okay, you are all seeing my feed, I trust? Good. I have to admit, using your civilian asteroid miners to throw rocks through the orbits of that world in order to keep capital ships from bombarding the cities is genius. I have to hand it to your species' ingenuity and willingness to step up. We can't let the locals have all the fun though, so let's get in there and do our part.
He took another moment to study the plot, checking the vectors for the two groups of the enemy fleet, the rocks being flung in the general direction of the beleaguered planet, and the fleet still in orbit. Dodge the rocks being flung at them, around said planet. He hit a few buttons, and the hologram lit up with lines of approach for his ships.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the plan of attack as it currently stands, fresh out of the computers. First flight, check the calculations, and make sure your ships can do what I expect them to do. We need to hit that wing headed for the miners just before second flight hits orbits. Second flight, look at your insertion, drop, and exit windows. Have your people check the math for each of your ships, and for the two that will be closest to you. I want to make absolutely sure this plan is solid, because when the feathers start flying, we will have a hard enough time making adjustments without having to compensate for errors. You folks have the most important part to play in phase 1 of this operation, delivering troops and supplies to the people on the ground. Third flight, we are high ground. Our primary job is to keep an eye on first and second flights to make sure they don't get hit with something that they can't see and to watch for the reinforcements. Our secondary job is to nail any targets of opportunity in order to try and keep those lizards off balance and give first and second flights as much room for their wings as we can.
He studied the faces of his captains as they dutifully reviewed the reports and listened to his words. They'd all heard this speech from him more or less at least once, but they all paid attention as if they intended to burn his words into their brains. Good. The better they know and understand the plan, the easier it will be to communicate changes when they are necessary. A few more minutes of silence, and he leaned back a little to smile.
Very good, captains. We have been over all of this already, but you've had a few hours to consider everything and check the calculations. Questions, comments, concerns. Now is the time to air them. You are my captains and know your ship's abilities better than I do. So, speak now.
He felt the feathers on the back of his neck stand up a little as the captains obviously looked at one another across the conference call. I wish I could have called them all onto this ship again for this, but I'm not bringing us out of FTL so that we can sit and flap at one another face to face. Finally, one of the human captains, the most senior among them, looked him dead in the eye and spoke.
With respect, sir, the other captains and I believe you are severely underestimating our abilities. please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it is a bad plan, quite the contrary. We and our crews could just about pull it off in our sleep. The vectors you have given us will keep us clear of exultant fire as much as possible, and will never put any of our engines to more than 75% capacity. It should be a cakewalk. And therein lies our concern. We could do a great deal more. There are a lot of opportunities to hurt, or even cripple, Zoltan ships that are being passed up, engagements where we have the upper hand that we are instead avoiding, and...
Woomerson allowed himself a small smile as he held up his hand to interrupt.
You believe my plan is too conservative, and that your people can take greater risks than I am allowing while still coming out ahead. This, Captain, is not something I believe. It is something I know, without question, after seeing how you and your people fight.
He felt a moment of small satisfaction at the confused, slightly stunned, and slightly irritated looks on the faces of his captains. I wonder who will ask the obvious question. It didn't take long. Another of the captains, a woman with hair that reminded him of a crackling fire, spoke up with her eyes slightly narrowed.
If I may presume, then, Admiral, the reason you are being so conservative with this part of the plan is to make sure we have plenty in reserve for Phase 2,